Well, good morning. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and it's great to see such a good-sized crowd out here. I think we've just about filled the room, which I attribute either to our panel up here or to the urgency of the issue, or both. I won't spend a lot of time introducing our panelists. To my left, your right, is Jessica Matthews, who used to run the joint, but now has a much happier life.
Now has to work, right?
That's right.
It's an honest job.
That's right. Now has a much happier life as senior fellow. Ali Vaiz is from the International Crisis Group, and George Perkovich, who, of course, is also part of Carnegie and go-to on so many issues on Iran, and other things nuclear. And you've got, so we're going to run for about an hour, and then you've got a lunch, and then June Torbati is going to come back and moderate a panel on the question of the regional implications of the deal. So you've got a full morning and early afternoon. So let's dig right in. We're going to assume a fairly sophisticated knowledge for this crowd, because if you weren't deeply into these issues, you probably would have figured out something else to do today. Like go sit in Starbucks. And but I want to do a quick round asking the question in slightly different ways to fit the expertise of our panelists here. On the first question of what's the best part of the deal as we have understood it from reading the American fact sheet and the Iranian description, which I wouldn't say contradict each other, but let's say they're not always in perfect confluence. And then what's the worst part, which gets us onto the question of what needs to change between now and June 30th. And then we'll get into some of the politics of this. So, Ali, let me start with you. From a national perspective for the U.S. and for Iran, run us through the best and worst of this thing in short order.
Well, David, I think let's start with the Iranian perspective. Remember that for President Rouhani, when he was chief negotiator, one of the primary goals from 2003 to 2005 was to prevent the Iranian nuclear dossier from being referred to the Security Council. Well, now, after being in office for 2 years, he has been able to actually get Iran under consideration, out of consideration under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which for him, it is going to be the biggest political victory with which he's going to justify some of the nuclear concessions that he had to make to get to this point. I think the weakest point of the understanding, at least as much of it as we know now, which makes it difficult for him to defend the agreement back home, is the fact that the issue of sanctions relief is still very vague. It's not exactly clear how this is going to work. Although I tend to believe that the negotiators have been able to agree to much more on sanctions relief that they have divulged publicly. From a U.S. perspective,
Let me just stop you on that point. What do you think that deal is? Is it a certain day for the agreement to be signed and then a later date for the implementation?
Yeah, that is going to be part of the setup. But I think from the early days that the negotiations started, both sides came to the conclusion that you need to front-load this agreement in order for both sides to be able to go back home and show tangible achievements. So both sides decided to do maximum amount of implementation in the early months. And I think if we get a deal in July, August, sometime in the summer, in the next 4 to 6 months, the parties will start implementing. Iranians will start dismantling, removing the calandria of the Arak reactor, given access to the inspectors, providing new design information questionnaires to the IAEA, et cetera. And the P5+1 will start providing the regulations, rules, and laws that are necessary for lifting the sanctions. And at a specific point in time, both sides will start implementing. And as I said, it's front-loaded. I think from the U.S. perspective, the most important achievement is that the agreement effectively blocks all the pathways to nuclear weapon, and it has very strong verification mechanisms. The downside, of course, is that at the end of the day, this is a compromise. And the U.S. had to allow, for example, 1,000 centrifuges remain in Fordo, and had to accept that the restrictions will start gradually coming off at year 10, and at the end of the day, this is a 15-year agreement. It has a sunset period. So, but overall, I think both sides have enough to be able to defend the deal back home.
Great. So that leads us naturally to George. So, George, from a technical perspective on it, Ali has told us that this was a compromise, but he also said it effectively blocks all pathways to a nuclear weapon, at least for 10 years, maybe for 15. There's some question about in between. First of all, do you agree with that? As you look at this, does it block all pathways?
Yeah, I think basically, a lot of this depends on what your thinking was beforehand. So for me, I was never that worried, haven't been that worried that Iran would try to take declared facilities where the IAEA already is, and then break out to try to achieve nuclear weapon capability from that. And so this agreement further kind of reaffirms that idea because it limits what they can do in the declared facilities. They roll back some of it at Natanz, the Iraq reactors redesigned, all of that I think is to the good. If the concern were more that Iran would try by undeclared means or secret means to kind of ramp up on a capability, then I think this agreement also is very positive because the verification elements of it are significant. I mean, there's one qualification about that, but in general, they're significant. You talk about on the uranium side, now there's an understanding of from the mines to the milling facilities, to the conversion facilities, the centrifuge parts facilities, the assembly facilities, all that's before you get to actual enrichment. You're talking about monitoring. So that's unprecedented. There are two other elements that I think are potentially of even greater significance, though they're not detailed. And that is that it's said in the U.S. fact sheet that there would be a supply chain that would be monitored. So depending on what that is, it greatly would build your confidence that they wouldn't be able to have a secret supply chain. And then, as importantly, it talks about a declared procurement channel that would be registered also through the UN. So if I understand that, and it says of sensitive parts. So depending on what you put in there, if there's a declared procurement channel, by definition, anything that you detect through intelligence means or otherwise that's coming into Iran from a different channel is a violation of the agreement. Greatly eases both the burden of your intelligence collection, but more importantly, the burden of interpreting intelligence. A lot of what we've had under the NPT going back to Iraq is stuff gets detected and then people say, well, it's not really a violation of the NPT, or it's not really a violation of the safeguard agreement, or it's not really part of a weapon program, it's something else. And that takes years to sort out. Then you can't get the Russians or somebody else to agree with it. If you now have a commitment that they only procure through this declared channel, and then you have intercepts or other things that tell you, there's an agent out buying this other thing, it's a violation. You don't have to spend all that time debating and sorting it out. It's a violation of an agreement that would be registered as a UN Security Council agreement among the P5. That's a huge deterrent against undeclared breakout. And so I think it's very important.
Doesn't that just back it up a step? Because you've got to have then a long list of everything that...
It depends what's in it. That's what we don't know.
No, but you have still the same problem of making a list.
Right.
Which becomes a sort of a de facto shopping list.
Right. So the issue is, having a declared channel is very important, and the question is what's in it. And you can start with very easy things, which I assume they mean fuel cycle capability, for example. I would assume it wouldn't be that hard to say neutron initiators. or
Yes.
anything that's listed in the possible military dimension about past activities, you could put in declared channel and say, if you're procuring anything for that, in the future, A, either don't do it, or B, it's got to be declared channel. So I don't think it's that hard.
George, let me push you on one element of your analysis here, which is essentially that by doing the declared channel, you're taking some of that mushiness out of the system of is somebody violating or not, which has taken up so much time, and ultimately would kick it right back to the Security Council. Okay, so think about how we got here. We got here because Iran was not answering a series of questions from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It referred them to the Security Council. The Security Council ultimately passed an escalating series of sanctions, but that process took a long period of time. Whatever we think of the sanctions, whether you think they drove them to the table or not, what they certainly didn't do was slow down the construction of centrifuges, or at least they've built up considerably over the past couple of years. So why are we to think that this time would be any different?
For a number of reasons. One, the history about the past was what Iran didn't agree to was the suspension that was, they agreed in 2003, but then gamed it, and so they resumed activity. Then in 2004, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, backed by IAEA, called on them to suspend. Suspension was the main issue that was a driver, and they said, no, we have a right, and clearly they were trying to get leverage. So I think under this agreement, as sketched, the bad news is Iran retains capabilities, which actually is leverage. The good news is precisely because they've retained those capabilities and have leverage, I think there's reason to think they'll fulfill the agreement in the first place. But if you have a new agreement this explicit, done with the P5, and the issue of a declared channel, which isn't about rights and so on and so forth, then they violate it, I think, precisely because we've just spent the last, 13 years doing this. The U.S. at least, and I would suggest France at least, and the U.K. at least, are going to say, like, this is a violation. We're not going to go debate it for a couple of months in the UN. So I think precisely that history is what's going to make it more likely that if they violate a new agreement that's going to be laboriously negotiated in detail, I don't see people waiting that long to respond to it.
Okay, so Jessica, you've heard Ali lay out what the national interests were. You've heard George lay out what the technical strengths are and a couple of the vague areas. Tell us what you think the alternatives are, if there are any, between, save the easiest for you, if there are any between now and June 30th or beyond that would improve this in a significant way.
Well,
or alternatives of the risk if you walk away.
The best part of the deal is that it's not one of the two absolutely awful alternatives. I wrote a piece 15 months ago that said there are three alternatives in dealing with Iran, and nobody ever said to me, oh, you forgot a fourth. So as far as I'm concerned, there are three alternatives. One is go back to more pressure, and what we know, that one's been pretty well tested. More pressure leads to more centrifuges, and it's the route that Iran has taken all along, and it's lousy, obviously. It doesn't work. Sanctions, what we know about sanctions are they can raise the cost enormously, but if the sanctioned country chooses to pay the price, they don't stop the activity. We know that. The other alternative is military action, maybe a 4-year delay, followed by rebuilding everything as secure as Fordo, followed by not having very much idea at all, being essentially blind on the ground as to what's being rebuilt, followed by the need to rebomb at some point, but without knowing very well how close Iran is. it's a terrible option that puts us in a state of perpetual war, and it would surely unite the Iranian people in a way that they are not now around the absolute necessity of having a nuclear deterrent, and would probably prolong clerical rule in Iran. It would radicalize, it would certainly strengthen Iran's hardliners who have been saying this all along. So that's a terrible deal. So a deal is, which is by definition imperfect, because it's what you can negotiate, is the only route, seems to me, that is worth pursuing. And the question then is, can you get a better deal? Could you get a better deal? Or I suppose you could reframe that question is, does this deal have an Achilles heel or one or more killer weaknesses in it? I think, reading between the lines of what was announced in Lausanne and what was announced in the White House and what's been said in Tehran, that the work still to go is much more than filling in technical details and writing tight language. I think that there are aspects, if not fundamental ones, of both the sanctions lifting dance, what gets lifted when, and the inspections and verification regime that haven't been agreed to. That's I recognize that's a...
and maybe some of the R&D.
There may be some other things that haven't been agreed to. And a third one, I think, about which I feel very differently, those two, the first two, the sanctions lifting and the inspections regime are kind of all or nothing things. If we don't get those right, we don't have a deal. The one that I think is in a different category, but that is going to be very neuralgic, is this question of when and how and if Iran comes clean about what it did in pursuit of weapons before it stopped that. I have an maybe minority view, which is that knowing that will have some modest technical value to us, but countries hate to be put in a position of saying, oh, we violated this international agreement in the NPT treaty, and we're sorry. They hate it, and in Iran's case, it's multiplied by the fatwa. So now you have to layer on top of it a religious aspect of having to say you were wrong. I just don't think the Iranians are going to go there soon. And it may very well be, I mean, maybe there's a workaround. Push it to the way back end of this, backload this issue. But it may come to a point where we have to decide whether we care more about the future than the past. And for me, that's an easy call.
Before I press you on your main point, I just wanted to ask briefly both George and Ali about this issue of the possible military dimensions, because it's an interesting one. I have heard from negotiators, American negotiators, Europeans, the same phrase you just used. This is an agreement about the future, it's not about the past. On the other hand, if your overwhelming concern here, and maybe this is a good one for you, George, is if Iran actually did get one weapon's worth or two weapons worth of material, how long would it take to fabricate that into a bomb? You'd want to know pretty well how much progress they made. And you would learn that from PMD unless our intelligence agencies have that knowledge already and haven't decided to share it with all of us. But
couple thoughts. One is, my sense is the intelligence community feels like they do have a good sense of what they've learned, but that's just picking up things here and there. Secondly, I don't think it's as much a timing issue because we've already stipulated a benchmark in the agreement, which, by the way, 1 year, which is totally arbitrary in my mind, but it's a political necessity to keep score. You know, you needed a standard on how to evaluate. So somehow this came out a while ago. It was going to be a year, but why not 11 and a half months, or why not 14 months? I mean, it's basically arbitrary. And so the weaponization piece has just been kind of stipulated. I don't know necessarily based on actual calculations of how long it would take to turn material into a device. I think what you more want to gain by having an understanding of these past activities is who did it, where were they located, how was it organized, so that you're better able to try to detect if it happens again. Kind of, you want modus operandi and people to deal with the undeclared issue. I don't think it's as much about a timing thing as it's about an intelligence thing. It's an important issue. I think it's actually more important for the IAEA. If the IAEA is a valuable institution, which I would submit it is in the overall nuclear order, and this is its job, and it says it has not received the required cooperation in order to do its job, then if the leaders of the international community kind of walk away from that and say, okay, the IAEA is important, but when things get really important, we don't care that much about it. That's not
bad
good.
Precedent,
that's not good for the international system. So to me, that's the strongest argument. Now, there are a number of ways that could be addressed. The Iranians don't have to confess. I think they would never confess for reasons that Jessica talked about, saying, yes, we had a nuclear weapon program. All they have to do is say, you can talk to Larry over there, and he's willing now to talk about the experiment he did. And so Larry can talk about his experiment without saying why it was. He said, I came into the lab here, and I used these materials, and I did it for 3 days, and so on and so forth. And there doesn't have to be an admission of purpose. Or the Iranians can say, you know what, we don't have those files. There's lots of ways to actually finesse this. So at the end of the day, the IAEA can conclude, you know what, we think we've gotten all the information we're going to get, and we're not able to make a conclusion. But that's a conclusion. And so then you can check the box and say, you know, so I think it's doable, but lastly, I think the Iranians, for all sorts of reasons, are going to save it for the end. Because it can be somewhat humiliating. And then, by the way, when you're in Iran, you talk to people, they say, wait, you want us to make scientists available so the Israelis can assassinate them? That's a hard one to answer. 5 of them have been whacked. And you say, well, no, trust us. We wouldn't do that. It's difficult. So they have rebuttals. I think at the end, though, is when this would happen, and the necessity of it really is about the IAEA, I think.
Ali, pick up on this point. Can you imagine the Iranians being willing to do on PMD? And do you believe George's argument here that you'd have to push this to the end, when at that point your leverage of sanctions for them to reveal is pretty well shot?
Well, David, my understanding of the dynamics in the negotiating room is that actually this issue is not going to be backloaded. It's going to be addressed in the early stages of the agreement, in fact, in very early stages of the agreement, but with one caveat. Of course, this is not going to be fully resolved. It is going to be satisfactorily resolved, which basically means that the IAEA will need to make sure that, as George mentioned, there are some of these suspect activities are not ongoing, and they don't need to have a complete picture for that. And I also want to add on something that Jessica mentioned. There are still disagreements on some of the details, but what happened in Lausanne is that they got a mutually acceptable formula on all the key elements of this comprehensive agreement. Otherwise, it would have been really political suicide to come out and stand on that stage and announce an understanding. I mean, the Iranians would never have accepted to announce that there is an understanding if the key issue of sanctions, for example, was unresolved. So unresolved, I think, is a strong word. But do they have all the details of the implementation plan? Not yet. And that the bargaining process of that is going to be difficult. I don't deny it.
Parallel announcements without a common interpretation is an open door for the kind of problems, for differences in interpretation to emerge in this period, say before June 30th, that reach fundamentals. So I'm less optimistic than you are. I think, and there is always, and in particularly in this case, there is this enormous push of the deadline to get it done, and in that push you can leave some things, and there have been many cases that come back and bite you.
So, Jessica, tell us how you would interpret, and I'm going to ask our other panelists this as well, the Supreme Leader's comments. What kind of limits does that put on Zarif, Foreign Minister Zarif, when he comes back for the June 30th? And then just give us your rundown of what you think the congressional risks are here.
Well, if I may, I will leave to Ali how to interpret the Supreme Leader's comments. I mean, to me, they underlined what I suspected, which is that there is negotiating still to do on I keep calling the dance, the back and forth of what happens when, in terms of lifting the sanctions, and that was a positioning thing. Meant to, firm up the Iranian side. It may also have been directed at the Congress, because it would not be impossible for Iran, and George has been writing this for 2 years, to be setting us up to violate this thing before they do. So Congress, for me, the most important thing, I said at the beginning, what are the choices that we actually have, and what are the policy alternatives that are available for going forward? For me, having a discussion in Congress about a deal that isn't finished says to me that the people who want to force such a vote, or who want to say the agreement is no good, are people who don't want a deal. I don't know how else to interpret. It is irrational to think that you have a discussion, you have a vote, you say, I am flatly opposed to this, and then you say, you're flatly opposed to what? And I haven't yet read real criticism, serious criticism, and I put the Kissinger-Schultz piece absolutely in this category, the criticism of the deal that says, here's what I do instead. And for me, if you don't say that, you have said nothing. You don't even have an entrance ticket, in my view. So I am hoping Congress can find a way to assert itself, to having some kind of role, and to that postpones decisions until they have something to evaluate, and which is either June 30th or sometime after that.
Ali, how did you interpret the Supreme Leader's comments?
David, Supreme Leader's comments are usually very confusing because, of course...
I was certainly confused.
He's always very Delphic in his speeches, and he speaks to different audiences. But I think he had several specific objectives with this speech. He wanted to first reassure his core constituents by pointing out that this nuclear deal, this compromise, is a very narrow compromise. It is not the beginning of a slippery slope in which the Islamic Republic is going to start compromising on other issues of strategic interest. So he insisted that this is a narrow negotiation just on the nuclear issue. He also wanted to reassure the security establishment that this deal is not going to endanger our national security. That's why He insisted on the fact that inspectors anywhere, anytime, is not going to happen. But he also had an audience with the government. He sent a message to support, once again, reiterated support for the negotiators, and said something that was overlooked by most Western media, which is he said for the first time what the Supreme Leader has been saying what President Rouhani has been saying for a long time, which is that if we get a balanced nuclear deal, this could become a gateway for further engagement with the United States on other issues of common interest. And I would say his third audience was the United States, and he wanted to send the message that Iran is not in a position of weakness, is not too eager for a deal, and he did it by not showing a lot of enthusiasm for this understanding, by saying that June 30th is not really a hard deadline, and also by reiterating some of his red lines. And let me add, sometimes it's more important to pay attention to what he doesn't say than what he does say.
Yes.
And it's really important that he didn't criticize some of the really painful concessions that Iran had to make to get to this point. I mean, it was just a few months ago that when he said Iran needs 190,000 centrifuges in a few months, a lot of people in this city said the deal is not going to happen, right? But now Iran has accepted 5,060 centrifuges for 10 years.
Last point before we go out to open questions here. George, you've written, as Jessica mentioned before, that the trick here for the Iranians is to make Congress take the first step to blow things up so that you can then fracture the alliance. And that if we did sanctions, additional sanctions, we'd have no one else with us. So if you were convening the grand meeting in Tehran this week of, Carnegie's Tehran equivalent, and the subject matter was, how are we doing on our strategy of getting the Americans to blow this up first? How would you grade it?
I would say we have a problem that the Senator Corker guy is actually fairly enlightened and maybe on to what we're interested in. But we do have Senator Cotton going for us. And so, there's a question of how this will work out. And I think the challenges that, and something that Ollie alluded to, where the leader talks about this is a narrow nuclear arrangement that we're focused on, and I think that's very important. And the issue is going to be linkage. And this is what happened with the agreed framework with North Korea back in 1994. It was a nuclear deal, but it called for normalization of relations between the United States and the DPRK. Except it didn't say how that was going to be done or sequences or other things. And so what happened is the DPRK went around doing things after that agreement, missile testing, sending a submarine down off South Korea, other things that people here didn't like. And so members of Congress naturally said, let's stop providing what we promised in the nuclear deal because they're being bad in these other domains. And I think on this agreement with Iran, which is strictly limited to nuclear, where the U.S. has said we're going to maintain the sanctions on terrorism and other things, how do you stop members of Congress from nonetheless, the next time, an Ayatollah says something nasty about Israel, or there's another Hezbollah missile shipment going across Syria into Lebanon, that somebody says, let's pass new legislation, to sanction Iran, or let's block the waivers on this. And so it's this question of keeping it confined and the U.S. implementing it versus linkage. And I think the Iranians, especially Zarif and Rouhani, are so talented that any time the U.S. does something that's not within the scope of whatever's agreed, they're going to get leverage internationally because the rest of the world's going to look at the agreement and say, well, you know what, they're right. And that is going to be a difficult challenge. Like I say, some hope with Senator Corker that you could manage this, but
Okay, so let us go out to questions in the audience, and we're going to ask you to, when you get a microphone, wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and actually ask a question. But I realize the last of that on that list is the hardest. We'll start with Robin, since she's a professional question asker here. So,
thank you, Robin Wright from the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. I have a question for George first. Explain to us how long it might take to do all the things mentioned in the fact sheet. In other words, if there is phase sanctions withdrawal, how long would it take to meet the basic demands of dismantling facilities, cutting back on centrifuges, and so forth? So we have a sense of how long it might be if the U.S. interpretation applies and sanctions is then lifted. And a quick one for Ali. I'm curious. The Iranians seem so surprised by the fact sheet. Do you think that they were surprised by the content of the fact sheet, or the fact that they looked like they were kind of preempted, or the rug pulled out from underneath them? Was it the substance, or was it just the process that they opposed?
Great questions, Robin. I'm not truth in advertising. I'm not so adept that on the technical implementation I could give it to you precisely. But I think the big issue is it depends on what's in it. So, for example, we understand that part of the agreement would be that the Iranians agree to redesign the Iraq reactor. So what part of that process do you then say checks off the box, which then allows you to waive the sanctions? Because they bring a paper design that says, okay, this is how we're going to design it now, and you say, okay, good. Or are there things that they actually have to do in terms of pouring concrete and bending things? I don't. In the fact sheet, it doesn't say what that means. The fact sheet doesn't speak to the question of what happens to the 20% enriched uranium, for example. And depending on what it would say and how they would have to meet that requirement. For example, is it turning it into fuel for the Tehran research reactor? Well, how long does that take? I think it's unknown at this point, but it's a question of months. So I think depending on how a lot of the details actually get nailed down will affect, how many more months it would take to fulfill those elements. Because it talks about nuclear related. When Iran takes the nuclear related steps.
Key steps.
So
it's a question of what is a key step?
So it's just impossible for me to give a precise answer on that.
Robin, on the fact sheets, the dilemma that negotiators had in Lausanne was that they had to accommodate the Supreme Leader's demand of no specifics and Congress's demand of specifics. And it was very hard. So, like everything else in these negotiations, they found the middle ground. And the middle ground was to put out a statement that was quite general, and Zarif can refer to that as the main document. And the U.S. could put out its own interpretation, version, fact sheet, whatever you want to call it, in order to be able to respond to Congress and stave off more pressure from Congress. I was talking to an Iranian official just a week before the understanding was announced, and he was saying, we have two options. One is a 5-line statement. The other one is a 15-page document with all the details for both sides. But then we have to start the fight of defending the deal right now where we don't have it yet. Right. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, but we also understand that the Americans need specifics. So I think it was inevitable at the end of the day, but again, it's one of the things we have to blame Congress for, I think.
Okay, hand right here, young lady in the blue.
Oh, thank you for calling me young. Stephanie Cook with Energy Intelligence Group. I have a question. I'm not sure, I think probably Ali, but in Lausanne, the Deputy Foreign Minister Arakchi came in on Sunday night and announced in Farsi that, which you translated very well, that
I didn't translate.
Well, somebody, yeah,
but somebody
anyway,
did for me. Yes.
Right. But anyway, that their big news was they're not going to ship any uranium out of the country, which had been understood to be agreed as part of the 3 legs of getting to 1-year breakout. Now, what's interesting is Kerry said in his speech in Lausanne, well, we'll either, I've forgotten what the first one was, but he said we could sell it in the international markets, which is very interesting. The Iranians are saying we'll swap it for uranium. And I know that they're actually now getting short on uranium. And I'd like to know how you think the U.S. would view this business of swapping for uranium, which obviously opens the door for more enrichment. So it's just an interesting puzzle, and I kind of wonder how they're going to resolve this problem of the lowering the enriched.
Okay, and you can hand the microphone straight back to the young lady behind you. Who wants to take on that issue? The Arachi statement, just to give context to people, led to an immediate denial by the U.S. that there ever had been a informal understanding that they would ship this stuff out of the country, which struck us as a little bit strange because there had been an informal agreement that had been previously reported and never denied by the U.S.
But I think it's a categorical question. In other words, beyond this, I can't tell you what the U.S. would say about swapping for uranium, but what I can say is any time one of these things shifts, so for example, they're not exporting it, there can become 4 other ways to address the problem. Okay, so you're not going to export it, but we agree that you only have 300 kilograms, so then what are you going to do to reassure us that 300 kilograms, can't be used? Oh, and we're going to need more verification now because you just changed the term. So I think you can be sure that there will be more moving parts depending on what they would do. So if they're going to now trade for natural uranium, there's going to be all sorts of things about, we need to know where the contract's done. We need to see the contracts. We got to monitor the ships.
Hi, Rachel Oswald, reporter with CQ Roll Call. My question for the panel has to do with the imposition of sanctions if a violation is determined. The administration has said that that no one country can have a veto over imposing sanctions if violations determined. And then there have been reports that this could be conducted by a majority vote. But it's not clear to me if it's a majority vote of the P5, of the P5 plus Germany, or of the entire Security Council. Or maybe you guys are hearing something entirely different, and Russia and China have still not budged on their preference for retaining veto power. Thanks.
Jessica?
I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that either. It was pretty unclear to us. Anybody else?
We don't know the specifics.
We will forward that question to the American negotiating team. Okay. Gentleman on the aisle in the check blue shirt right there. There's a mic coming right behind you.
Can I just say one quick word on this, though? I think it does underline, the question's a good one, that underlines the importance of what comes after the deal, right? We've got 3 terrible months to go. And a huge debate about, is this a good enough deal once it's in front of us, we hope. And there will be an inevitable then sort of sense of, okay, we did it. And Bob Gallucci, in a piece this past weekend about the North Korean deal, made the point that one of the mistakes that we made in that was less in the deal than in its implementation and what came after.
You say, okay, the great temptation to say, okay, that's finished. Next.
Yeah, next.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of nexts in the Middle East. But the idea of setting up some kind of a group that oversees implementation of the deal on an international basis, just on a continuing constitutive basis. So you don't have to wait till the U.S. intelligence comes in and says, we saw the importation of such and such and such and such, and then sit down and talk about whether that, I think is a really important part of what would strengthen this.
Okay, so the gentleman in the blue.
Thanks. My name is Hart Schwartz. When the word linkage came up, it reminded me of the discussions over détente with the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and I'm curious, how do these negotiations compare to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 or the SALT treaties that I think Nixon and Reagan signed with the Soviet Union? Is it a similar situation?
This is, I think this is much, much harder. The internet hadn't been invented then. Social media didn't exist. Cable news didn't exist. One of the parties, the Soviet Union, was a totalitarian state. Now all states have politics, but it's nothing like the politics in Iran, which are quite fluid and dynamic and vicious. So it was. In those negotiations, part of the difficulty was relations between the military and the civilians and the transfer of information amongst the Soviet team was difficult. But I think it was much simpler. Back in those days, you could actually imagine and witness bipartisan cooperation in the United States. Members of Congress actually lived in the same kind of blocks in different parties and would associate in the evening with each other. It was a very, very different dynamic that I think was much easier than what we're talking about here. We weren't worried about terrorism then. You weren't talking about terrorism, state sponsors of terrorism. There's a list of 100 things I can think of that make this much harder than those things were.
And also, we were under no illusions that we were dealing with a weak country who could be pushed around. We knew we were dealing with a peer competitor, and so there were no, and a lot of critics now seem to have this idea that Iran is some country that's been defeated on the battlefield and can be just forced into agreements that probably can't be.
Barbara?
Thanks. Excellent panel. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and I'll monitor. A couple of technical things, and then one broader question. George, on the 20%, David Albright came out with and ISIS, the other ISIS, came out with an analysis over the weekend. And at one point he says that they have 50 kilograms of near 20%, and in another place he said they had 300 and some odd kilograms of near 20% LAU in various forms. What's supposed to happen to this stuff? He was very concerned that a lot of it is in oxide form, and he said that's not good enough. And is this related to what happens to the excess LAU in general and what they're going to do with that? And then the broader question is, what are some of the positive things that might come out of this in terms of nuclear safety and more cooperation by the international community with Iran to do things like get rid of the TRR, which is antiquated, to make sure that they don't build more Busheers, which is a Frankenstein's monster of a reactor, and that in general, they actually have the cooperation they need so that this is a safe program going forward for the Iranian people who live around these facilities. Thanks.
On the first one, the short answer again is I don't know, because I haven't seen any fact sheet that actually really speaks in any detail to the 20% material. It talks about LEU, Iran won't, enrich above, 3.57 or 6.7, and then the stockpile won't exceed 300 kilograms, but it doesn't give you the base from which they're counting, and it doesn't specifically address the question about 20%. So I simply don't know. On nuclear safety, this is an important point, and thus far I think has been a missed opportunity that could be captured, and it could even be captured by the UN Security Council resolution or even a congressional move here. And that is to basically have Iran commit also to be party to all the conventions with states that have peaceful nuclear programs are. So, for example, there's only 2 countries with reactors who aren't part of the Convention on Nuclear Safety, Iran and North Korea. Iran should become part of the Convention on Nuclear Safety. There's no reason for it not to do that. It hasn't ever really been a demand. It seems to me it could be part of a broader... the liability conventions, the international liability conventions, they're also not party to that. Well, if you're going to have a peaceful nuclear program going forward, you should be part of the international liability conventions. There are other kind of accoutrements or components of what states with peaceful programs do that Iran should be asked to join. And they haven't been, and they haven't done it themselves. Now, this is more than window dressing, because when you start talking about liability, as we know in India for the last 10 years, your parliament gets involved, and you say, well, wait a minute, we could have an accident with these things? And you say, yes, and there's limited liability, and you start, and wait a minute, the vendor's not going to be liable, so you're telling me the Russians aren't liable for this thing? It starts to become interesting. Well, welcome to the grown-up world of peaceful nuclear energy. And so they should be asked to do that and not paid to do it, because this is what, based on their own statements of purpose, this shouldn't be controversial. As far as I know, the U.S. and the other states haven't asked for this, in part because arms controllers don't know about peaceful nuclear energy, nuclear industry does. And so there's an opportunity here, I would say.
If I can add one thing, Barbara, that we know is that nuclear cooperation is going to be a big part of this agreement as part of positive incentives that are going to be provided to Iran. For example, some elements that we know of is cooperation on nuclear fusion with France, cooperation on accelerators. The Russians are going to help with fuel fabrication. And there might be other...
Ultimately, Fordo is supposed to have international representation.
Right. Iraq is going to be converted in cooperation with P5+1 members, and there were going to be some smaller reactors constructed in the south of Iran with other P5+1 members.
Well, we're getting near the end, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a lightning round of 3 questions to which we will have 3 answers, and then we're the last thing standing between you and your lunch. So we'll start with the young lady right down here with her hand up. Then we'll go in the way back over there, and then the gentleman in front here. Okay.
Hi, Mary Louise Kelly. Question for Jessica and maybe you, David. How firm is the June 30th deadline? We keep hearing hints that maybe it's not so firm. Do we risk losing momentum? Is there some magical development that's possible in July that's not in August?
Great. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, Darrell Kimball, Arms Control Association. A question about what happens if there is no final agreement by June 30th, or if there is and Congress decides in an up or down vote to reject the deal, what are the actions that Iran could take given its nuclear capabilities? What are the actions that the P5 could take? And just very quickly, the 20% material. George, the extension of the interim deal in November of 2014 stipulates that all of that material shall be, by June 30th, 2015, either diluted to low-enriched material or converted to fuel plates. So that's what's supposed to happen before June 30th. That's why it wasn't in the fact sheet from Lausanne.
Okay, and the last question was right here.
Excuse me. Good morning. Charles Newstead from the State Department, and I hasten to add I'm speaking for myself, not for the department. To answer, try to get a couple of quick points across. First, on the 20% enrichment, that is a very vital point because enrichment is like a triangle. The bottom, where it's very broad, is lots of material needs to go in. You get way up to 20%. The triangle is much smaller. It's much quicker to go to a bomb to 95% or 93%. So we have a very good idea. We can calculate. We know how many centrifuges they have, we think at least, and we can calculate how much material they had. We know how much 20% material they have. And that's vital to either get them under control, to blend that down to 5% material. They could make money on that and sell it, and all that could be worked out in a way.
Can we get to your question?
Yeah, sorry. The question is really this. Between the dilemma between Jessica and George as to the fact that Iran would probably not like to admit, no state wants to, that they were making weapons and bad boys and all that. We don't need to do that. We can find diplomatic language to finesse that, but we'll get a secret protocol where we would have them tell us what we need to know. And then to take care of the assassination problem for the Israelis and Mossad, we would give these people international protection if they wanted to and relocate so they wouldn't have to worry and have a good life.
All right. I'm not sure I heard a question there, but we'll okay, so on the first question on June 30th, just briefly, we were discussing this before we came out. I'm not sure there is anything particularly sacred about June 30th. Certainly Rouhani said the other day that it wasn't necessarily sacred. I'm not sure for Americans it should be. But
except the end of the JPOA.
Right. But so they would have to either extend it or figure out what was going to happen with that. So tell us what you think the options are to get to Darrell's question of what would the result be in Congress and so forth.
Well, there's so many degrees of freedom that you can't. I mean, Iranians, almost by, I think, in their DNA, don't meet deadlines. So negotiating deadlines anyway. So I thought part of it might be sort of setting up that, it would be another few days after and try to raise the pressure. Or if you're going to do it, if you feel like you can't get there by June 30th, they would then have to also agree to extend the JPOA until a final agreement was reached. The difficulty, Daryl's question is the tougher one than what happens in Congress. Seems to me that the best outcome there can be now is Congress says we want to have a voice, but we're going to wait till we see a final deal. And my guess is they will be forced to say, if not June 30th, then some other date, right? And but they're much more likely to say June 30th. And then what would happen then? You can always, if there's goodwill, you can always find a way around. But I don't think we're looking at a case of goodwill. And then that would then put more pressure on the negotiators to get it done by midnight on the 30th.
Sure. Just quickly on Daryl's point about the 20%, thank you for that. I do think if what the JPOA calls for in Iran dilutes it, then that's part of the 350 kilograms they would have, and so that would address it that way. But if it's turned into fuel, I would think that you would want further agreement about how long until that fuel is irradiated and so on. So I don't think it's done with, and I think it will have to be specifically addressed in an agreement. And on your point, Daryl, about what could Iran do if, to me it's less about no agreement, but if an agreement is rejected or sabotaged here, what I would expect them to do is actually to then try to break up the sanctions regime. So I wouldn't expect them to start acting provocatively in the nuclear domain by enriching to 20% or raising the level of enrichment and so on and so forth. I think they'd wait on that. But I think they would go around to the key trading partners, and you see what we're dealing with. This Congress is owned by somebody else, and they will sabotage anything. We did everything we could. You supported this agreement. We need to start peeling off the sanctions and be virtuous for as long as they could while trying to actually undo the sanctions regime is what I would predict.
You get the last word, Ali.
Let me just add a point to excellent points that Jessica made about the deadline. I think it's not surprising that both sides are trying to downplay the importance of June 30th deadline. No one wants to be seen as desperate for a deal. But I think this is actually a very dangerous gamble, and for three specific reasons. One is that if you look at the history of these negotiations in the past 12 years, and at the history of Iran's relations with the U.S. in the past 36 years, it has rarely happened that the two sides have been on the same wavelength. And if something happens and this opportunity is lost, I don't know if we can get there again in the near future. Second, I would say, what is most likely to happen is that we would get into another game of chicken that wouldn't get us closer to a deal, would only result in wasting the precious time. And this is what happened in July 2014 and November 2014. We don't need to go through that experience again. And then the third, which I think is a huge risk, is that as we get closer to 2016, we get entangled into electoral cycles in the U.S. and in Iran. Remember, in February 2016, there's the parliamentary elections in Iran. The Iranians might very well argue, let's wait until the elections are over so that no one can exploit the outcome of the negotiations for electoral purposes. And of course, we have elections in this country. So I think the sooner, the better.
Well, having resolved fully all outstanding issues, I thank each of our panel members. I thank all of you. And I think they're resuming here around 1 p.m.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Yegane Torbatsi. I'm a reporter for Reuters based here in Washington, and I previously was based for Reuters in Dubai, where I primarily covered Iran. We have with us today 3 top experts on different parts of the Middle East who I think will be able to offer us some broad insights into how the nuclear deal might affect not only Iran's behavior in the region, but also the calculations of various regional actors. I won't go too in-depth as far as introductions, but to my right is Karim Sajjadpour. He's a senior associate in the Carnegie Endowment's Middle East program and is a leading researcher on Iran. To my left, my near left, Yazid Sayyiq is a senior associate at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he focuses on the Syrian crisis and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process, among other topics. And to my far left is Fred Wayre. He's a senior associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment, and he focuses on Gulf political and security affairs, Libya, and U.S. policy in the Middle East. So while the topic for immediate discussion today is the repercussions of a nuclear deal with Iran, given our panel's interests and expertise, it would also be good to touch on other key regional issues unrelated to the nuclear deal. So we have about an hour for discussion, and I think I'll start with a broad question to each panelist. So Karim, let's start with you. There's 2 competing theories of how a nuclear deal with Iran would affect Iran's behavior in the region. The first posits that it could lead to wider cooperation and reintegration of Iran into the regional order and cooperation between Iran and the U.S. on other issues, perhaps. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Leader made some reference to this in his speech last week, although obliquely. The other theory posits that once Iran gets sanctions relief, they'll have even more resources to fund the Assad regime, to fund Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, etc. And actually, Hezbollah's leader Nasrallah made a reference to this in his speech last week. So I was wondering if you could just kind of lay out for us which of these 2 theories do you find most persuasive and why?
Sure. First, thank you all for coming, and I'd like to before I answer, to preface my answer with 2 points. One is to welcome Yegane to Washington, D.C. This is her debut as a moderator, and I'm sure she will do a wonderful job. She has a very bright future ahead of her, and so that's the ancient Persian way of disarming the moderator. So that's one. Number 2 is that the Middle East is as you've widely heard, a graveyard for empires, and it's also a graveyard for forecasters and prognosticators. If you look at kind of the 4 major events in this region in the last 3-4 decades, the Iranian Revolution, the Oslo Accords, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the Arab Spring. These are all events that when they were analyzed in real time, the kind of broad assessment was much, much different to how they've been analyzed with the benefit of hindsight. I should say they were analyzed in real time much more optimistically. I think with the benefit of hindsight, we've seen all 4 of these things as failures. That's not to say that this Iranian nuclear deal is going to be seen as a failure, but I kind of look at it in 3 different silos, this framework agreement with Iran. Silo number 1 is the non-proliferation silo. And so how does this framework agreement impact the non-proliferation discussion? And I think in that context, it's been positive, right? It's reversed Iran's program if the deal is finalized, and it's opened it up to greater transparency and scrutiny than it currently is. So that's silo number 1. Silo number 2 for me is how does this impact Iran domestically? And I think the fact that civil society and moderate forces are most enthusiastic about this deal and hardline forces are most concerned about the deal tells you how people inside the country think it's going to impact it. So I would say silo number 2 is also positive. Silo number 3 is the regional impact, and this is the one that I think I'm certainly most concerned about, and I think that many of the folks who negotiated the deal on the U.S. are most concerned about as well, because I think Yegane laid it out well in the question, and so you have strong proponents and advocates of the framework who argue that this is going to, this nuclear cooperation with Iran will then be applied to the broader U.S.-Iran relationship, and in particular the U.S.-Iran, on U.S.-Iran regional points of contention, whether that's Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, etc. And it will empower the forces in Iran who want to put national interests before revolutionary ideology. So this will lead to more U.S.-Iran cooperation and potential Iranian compromise on Syria, Iran being willing to entertain the prospect of a post-Assad Syria, Iran curtailing its support for Lebanese Hezbollah and turning Hezbollah from more of a kind of a militia to more of a non-violent political party. And here, Yazid can speak to that more than I can. And, we can talk about a whole host of issues in which Iranian behavior, regional behavior would be moderated. So that's the optimistic scenario. The more pessimistic scenario is that this framework deal, and if the deal is finalized, it would simply provide Iran much greater resources to pursue the policies that it's been pursuing in the Middle East since 1979, to double down on its current policies in the region, which again, the discussion about Iran's support for the Assad regime is always is very nebulous. A lot of coughing in today's audience. We need to get people water. There's some, like Stefan de Mistura, he's the UN Special Envoy for Syria, who said that Iran provides Syria $35 billion annually. I think that's probably a significant exaggeration, but even the low estimates are several $billion annually. There's a lot of discussion about Iranian material and financial military aid to the Houthis. I think the bottom line for me is that there's not a history of Iran's domestic politics are famously unpredictable. Its regional policies have been tremendously consistent since 1979. During the era of Mohammad Khatami, when you had a moderate president talking about dialogue of civilizations, there was no difference, there was no change in the Iran-Assad relationship. There was no change in the Iran-Hezbollah relationship. So I would say that in the short term, there is a valid concern that this nuclear deal will be transactional, that Iran will simply have far more resources to double down on its existing policies. I would also argue in the medium or long term, there is a valid hope that the deal becomes transformational, that over time you start to empower the Iranian foreign ministry and forces within the Iranian government and Iranian society who again want to put national interests before revolutionary ideology. The last thing I'd say is that I think that we need to put Iran's power in the Middle East in perspective. There's a lot of conspiracy theories and fears, especially in the Arab world and the Gulf Arab world, that Iran is bent on dominating the Middle East, and Iran is bent on being the regional hegemon. Look at the four countries in which Iran exerts the most influence in the region: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. These are all countries which are either in a state of civil war or are mired in internal turmoil, and they have very weak central governments. And Iran has always been very adept at filling power vacuums in the region, at exploiting minority grievances. And in the same way that the U.S. has mastered outsourcing jobs to China and to India, Iran is very good at outsourcing militancy to Arabs in the region, whether that's the Houthis or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or Hamas. So the long answer to the question is that I think there are valid fears that the skeptics who fear that this isn't going to improve Iran's regional behavior, they have valid concerns. And I think there are valid hopes that of the optimists who think that over the medium and long term, we may look back 10, 15 years from now and say that this nuclear deal was what led to greater U.S.-Iran cooperation.
I want to come back to you maybe after we go to the other panelists to talk a little bit more about Iran's interventions in the region. But Yazid, if I could turn to you at the moment, can you give us a sense of, within Syria and kind of the Assad regime, what are the concerns, if there are any, about what the effects of a nuclear deal would have on Iran's support for Assad or amenability to a post-Assad situation?
Well, I don't have any hard information, and I think I can't think of anyone I'm convinced has hard information as to what the Assad regime really thinks, what the inner core thinks. But they do seem periodically to fear what's coming from the outside world. When certain initiatives do tend to spook them, they get worried if they feel that the Russians, that Moscow's policy is not sufficiently supportive. And certainly the possibility that Iran would push for some sort of diplomatic framework that it can find common ground on with the US and people on the other side of the Syrian conflict certainly would be worrying the Assad regime. I mean, we have enough evidence of past moments when the Assad regime felt that there was a shift in the position of the external forces and got nervous about it. Right now, the question is, of course, is there any deal that Iran is likely to sign up to on Syria that goes far beyond the proposals that Iran has been putting out there since December 2012, which says, yes, there should be a transition. However, most of the key powers on security and defense and so on should remain with the president, and it's other powers that can be transferred to a new national unity government, a cabinet. I have yet to be convinced that there's anything on the ground that compels either the Assad regime nor even Iran to go far beyond those parameters, something that may eventually open the way for Assad to leave office, but not something that starts from that as the starting point. And from what we've seen of Syrian opposition debates, what the Egyptians have been pushing in the opposition conferences they've been hosting in Cairo, what the Russians have been promoting through the so-called dialogue in Moscow, none of this anymore starts with the precondition that Assad must go. So the Assad regime probably doesn't have too much to worry about on that score. And I think we're still some distance yet from the Iranians actually putting serious pressure on the regime itself. Mm-hmm. The one thing I'd want to add and throw into this mix is that although clearly an Iran nuclear deal opens the way for new thinking on a number of other issues, most of these are other issues in the countries that Karim mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. The local conflicts and dynamics are very much locally driven as well. They are not simply a manifestation of external rivalries. And I think that's very much the case in Yemen, where despite, frankly, a lot of propaganda about Iranian expansionism in Yemen, this conflict is almost entirely driven by local dynamics and by local arms, for that matter. I mean, the U.S. has just put into place a naval screen to prevent Iranian arms shipments. I don't think the Houthis need arms for the next 15 years, given how many arms there are already in the country. And the same could apply elsewhere. I mean, if we think of the positive scenario of the Iran nuclear deal and a comprehensive agreement easing tensions, in particular between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that would be nice to see. I think, though, that at best is a medium-term prospect. In the short term, I think all parties, local and external, will jockey for position ahead of any sort of renegotiation of the deal in Lebanon or in Syria or elsewhere. So we are likely to see an escalation in the initial period, not a de-escalation. And moreover, let's keep in mind that local actors, there are new local actors in each of these cases. In Yemen, it's the Houthis who've totally overturned the previous elite game of Yemeni politics. In Lebanon and Syria today, we have Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State, both of which are eyeing Lebanon as an area to expand in. And they may well respond to the prospects of Iranian-Saudi or Iranian-US understanding on any of these other files by actually trying all the harder to change things in Lebanon. So let's not fall too easily into complacency that even if the positive trend does happen, that the US, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others start to talk about Syria, for instance, or Iraq in more constructive ways, that doesn't necessarily translate into less conflict on the ground in places like Yemen or Lebanon.
And you just came here from Lebanon you're based in Beirut, and you just arrived last week. Can you give us a sense of what the situation is within Beirut? What's the feeling in terms of we're seeing deeper sectarian divisions around the region, as you're saying, an escalation within Lebanon, which is sort of ground zero for a lot of these issues. What's the feeling at the moment?
I actually left before the framework agreement was announced. I've been sort of on the road for a while, but from the reactions I've seen, we've got an example of what I was just discussing. In other words, whereas we're focused on Iran, nuclear, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the responses in Lebanon have been just as much to what's going on in Yemen. And so the Sunni moderate camp led by Saad al-Hariri, former prime minister of the Future Movement and the 14th March camp, which is aligned with Saudi Arabia, had, until a few weeks ago, been engaging in a very cautious, very low-key dialogue with Hezbollah to try and come to common understandings about how to seal Lebanon off from further inflows of Syrian refugees and how to insulate Lebanon from what will come next, which is Jabhat al-Nusra, Islamic State, and other flows across the border. Now, that was a positive direction. However, the moment that the Saudis went to war in Yemen, people like Saad al-Hariri couldn't remain neutral on this issue, couldn't go on talking to Hezbollah while Hezbollah was busily denouncing the Saudi intervention in Yemen. And so Saad al-Hariri and his camp and their media have been back on the offensive, supporting the Saudi position, denouncing Iran and the Houthis and their local allies. So that's, I think, a very good example of how the tensions between their regional supporters, in this case Iran and Saudi Arabia, as seen to play out in a place like Yemen, whether correctly seen or incorrectly seen, immediately have a knock-on effect for the local dynamic in Lebanon itself. Now, this is problematic because if Hariri ends up and his camp end up raising the tone too far with Hezbollah, that risks destabilizing internal Lebanese security. It risks feeding into the argument of more militant Sunni extremists and others in Lebanon who already say, you're being far too soft on Hezbollah, you should have already sort of announced confrontation with Hezbollah to defeat Shia domination or Hezbollah domination of Lebanese politics. And Hariri has been trying to steer a middle road between these two positions all along. He can't go too far in opposing Hezbollah without confirming and legitimizing the discourse of those who are further to his militant left or right or whatever it might be. But equally, if he doesn't stand up to Hezbollah, especially at moments when there are critical issues going on, then he looks soft and he loses more and more of his ground support within the country. One thing clearly he feels he cannot afford to lose is Saudi backing and favor. So he's been able to deal with his internal issues. He and his lieutenants have worked on sort of messaging Sunni communities in the north of the country, which are the most unhappy, for instance. But now that the Saudis expect a clear stand on something else, i.e. Yemen, Saad al-Hariri has gone along with that. So that is where you might have the potential for more understanding locally, which is then blocked externally, at a time when externally we may have a potential for understanding between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's just not going to be an easy matrix of how these things keep combining. I think you have to keep an eye on the rolling ball all the time because it's going to keep shifting.
So let's introduce another element of the matrix. Fred, could you speak to some of the dynamics within the Gulf countries as it relates to specifically this deal? Is there kind of a defeatist sense? What's their stance on it, and do they feel like they can influence the United States when it comes to negotiating the deal?
Yeah. Well, from the perspective of the Saudis, I mean, there's obviously this formal recognition of the deal, but that belies deep misgivings about its sustainability and especially Iranian duplicity. And more specifically, the notion that an Iran that is flush with cash will feel empowered to project its influence even more. I think the tone of the Saudi press has been one of somewhat defeatism and also deep suspicion. One commentator said that the U.S. has built a palace of sand and is now trying to convince others to try and live in it. And I think that really sums up the way they see this, at least over the short term. I think Yazid was right that I think in the near term we're going to see increased Saudi posturing and jockeying to really make the United States realize that the Saudis have a very real concern about Iran's regional power projection. And obviously the biggest example of that was Decisive Storm in Yemen, which I think was an attempt to sort of force the United States' hand. Unfortunately, in my view, the United States has fallen into that with this provision of intelligence support, the naval blockade, for what, to my mind, is a deeply flawed operation and is essentially a quagmire, and we can get into the specifics of that. Unfortunately, what you find in some of the Saudi press is this triumphalism about this operation, that this is finally the Arabs are taking matters into their own hands. The defense minister in Saudi Arabia is held up as Saudi Arabia's answer to Soleimani. There was one statement that said, were it not for Decisive Storm, the Iranians would not have conceded on the nuclear front. And so this speaks to me, my mind of a very dangerous overconfidence. And then we have of course the formation of this supposed Arab League force. Let me just say a few words about this issue of guarantees, if I can, and sort of what the United States could or should be doing. There's talk, obviously, with this impending Camp David talks that the United States should offer some sort of guarantees. Some parallels were drawn to what the United States did to Japan and Taiwan after the 1972 opening with China. That's a flawed analogy to my mind, because we have to take into recognition that the United States is already giving extraordinary aid to the Saudis. I mean, we're in the middle of this 20-year, $60 billion arms deal. We've got a massive force presence there. We just conducted a massive naval exercise that, although officially was not aimed at Iran, I think we can agree who the intended audience is. So the question to my mind is, what kind of assurances can we give to Saudi Arabia when the real nature of the Iranian threat is not, I think, a nuclear one? It may not even be a conventional one, but I think it's an asymmetric one, and it's an ideological one. Certainly, cybersecurity is a huge thing, perhaps greater intelligence sharing, perhaps some sea-based defenses, presence operations in the Gulf. But to my mind, and again, this goes back to what some of the other speakers said, I mean, Iran's real card that it plays in the Arab world and in the Gulf is that it exploits the problems of governance in these societies, disenfranchised minorities. And so the best way to shield yourself from Iranian influence, to inoculate your population, I think, is to do precisely what Obama said in his interview with Tom Friedman, and to undertake real sustainable reforms. And I think that comment was spot on. Unfortunately, it rubbed a lot of Saudis the wrong way, given the situation in there. But I think it was tough medicine, and it was needed. So.
And can you speak a little bit more about this sort of Sunni NATO force, as it's been called? Do you see that as being any effective at all? Is it just a sectarian?
Well, I think there are real problems about the operational issues. I mean, command and control budget. I mean, we can go into the weapon systems, but I mean, as I understand it, it's Saudi funded. The Egyptians are going to provide the bulk of the manpower. Perhaps some other countries will provide forces. But the question again is, we've been down this road before. We've seen this, and where has there ever been a truly joint multilateral Arab force? Even Peninsula Shield that went into Bahrain was primarily Saudi forces. I think this is really, quite honestly, a bit of theatrics, and I don't think we should take it, really at face value. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the other point of it is the sectarian dimension, and I think the sectarianization of these military conflicts, the fact that the anti-Houthi campaign is being portrayed by Gulf clerics and Sunnis in these starkly sectarian terms, is having a very toxic effect throughout the region, as we just heard in Lebanon. And I think this force that is being construed as a Sunni force could have the same ripple effect.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let me turn back to Karim just real quickly. You mentioned earlier that you think perhaps the role of Iran throughout the region is being overplayed, and we shouldn't see Iran as dominant as maybe the narrative says at the moment. At the same time, you see statements from Revolutionary Guards officials, from Iranian officials that seem very much to be celebrating their presence in these 4 Arab capitals. In your view, is Iran overextended, or are there comments, merely hubris, or is this really kind of a crucial element of Iranian power, and is it long lasting?
So it's a very good question, and I think that Iranians can never help themselves when touting their grandeur and their regional power. So you will see in the same article statements from senior officials or Revolutionary Guard commanders in Iran who say that Iran is now controlling 4 Arab capitals, and there may be a 5th on the way. And later in the same article, they'll say this talk of Iranian influence in the region is significantly exaggerated by the United States. But I do think that the dilemma that Iran has at the moment is that its regional appetite is expanding while its economy is contracting. Those things aren't sustainable over the medium and long term, and that's why this nuclear deal, if it happens, comes at a pretty good time. But the other thing I'd mention is that I think that Iran, for me, if I kind of look from 1979 to the present, the moment in which Iran's regional influence, in my opinion, one could argue that it's peaked at the moment, but I think it's the Iranian influence in the region is at the moment is not the way the regime would like to see its regional influence would be meaning it's driven by hard power. It's driven by their support for militia groups, whether that's Shiite militias in Iraq or Hezbollah or the brutality of the Assad regime or the Houthis in Yemen. I think they're much more comfortable with their influence in the region being soft power. And I remember in 2006, in the summer of 2006, there was a time in which the Israelis were bombing Lebanon, and Iraq was in a state of total carnage. And so there was tremendous sentiment in the region. There was kind of a regional outcry against the United States and Israel. And I think for that reason, there's kind of there's an inverse correlation between America's unpopularity in the region and Iran's popularity in the region. So the more unpopular America and Israel are, the more Iran's ideology tends to resonate. And I remember that year at Ramadan in Cairo, the most expensive selling dates were the Hassan Nasrallah dates and the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad dates. And now, given what's happening in Syria and in Yemen, Iran is no longer seen as this kind of pan-Islamic ideological champion. It's seen as this sectarian Shiite champion. And for that reason, there's tremendous Sunni and Sunni Arab antagonism towards Iran at the moment. I don't think that's something that Iran is not comfortable with this. They always try to be kind of, if you're a Shiite Persian country in a predominantly Sunni Arab world, you don't win followers by waving a Shiite flag and say, come follow us. So I think that, though they seem to have a lot of regional assets at the moment, I think you will see a lot of efforts from Iran in the coming weeks and months and years to try to tone down the sectarian narrative which is currently prevailing in the region, play up the ideological narrative, and the best way for them to do that is some type of conflagration again with Israel, because if the Arab world when the Arab world is focused on what's happening in Syria and Yemen and in Iraq, that's bad for Iran. If they're focused on Israeli crimes against Palestinians, that's good for Iran.
Mm-hmm. And to bring it back to the nuclear issue, if we see the nuclear deal as perhaps the product of tensions and negotiations within Iran's government, is there a chance that there could be a decision made, all right, the moderates get the nuclear deal and some sort of rapprochement on that issue, but then the hardliners get the regional policy, and they can push further with that?
Well, certainly the regional policies have been the domain of the Revolutionary Guards for a long time now, because, again, Iran's regional policies are very much about kind of the training and supporting of these various militia groups. That's not something that diplomats in the Iranian foreign ministry are very, they're not equipped to do that. So I don't see that balance shifting to the foreign ministry. Also because in some ways, Iran feels like its regional policies have been vindicated, right? 2-3 years ago, the conventional narrative, I remember, the U.S. government, top U.S. government official on Syria at that time said that Bashar Assad is a dead man walking. Now no one is talking about Assad having to go, it's simply as chemical weapons have to go. So if you feel like your policies have been vindicated, why would you shift that to the foreign ministry? Second, it's true that diplomats and the foreign ministry, led by Foreign Minister Zarif, have very adeptly negotiated the nuclear framework. But it's also true that it's the Revolutionary Guards who oversee the most sensitive nuclear sites which exist in Iran, whether that's Fordow facility, Parchin, etc. And I know this is a concern that U.S. negotiators have as we look in the implementation of this deal. Is it going to be easy for the foreign ministry who negotiated this deal to force the Revolutionary Guards to open up to greater transparency and verification? That's going to be a challenge. I just would say one final comment, which is that I saw an article yesterday in Haaretz from, it was quoting, it was an alleged quote from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who worried that it was alleged that in a meeting in the Knesset, he said his greatest fear is that Iran will actually abide by the deal, and that 12 to 15 years from now, Iran will be that much closer to having a nuclear weapon. And I think, frankly, that would be a champagne problem to have, that 10, 15 years from now, Iran will be part of the NPT. I mean, I think that there are going to be some real, near-term concerns about implementing this deal, let alone finalizing the deal. I think we've popped the champagne maybe too quickly in this town.
Well, I'll turn to questions soon. I just want to, Fred, you mentioned, your words, the quagmire in Yemen right now. Can you give us a sense of how you see that operation going? And it seems also that the U.S. is becoming more deeply involved, as you mentioned, with greater intelligence sharing and the naval blockade.
Well, I mean, this is a classic case of air power that's being applied to try to stop a deeply entrenched insurgent movement, and it's not having the desired effect. You've got 17 days of bombing, almost 700, I think, civilian casualties. It's prevented the Houthi takeover of Aden, but in other areas they're still deeply entrenched. In the north, sentiment is turning against the Saudis. I think the problem, again, is one of local, proxy forces. Who do the Saudis actually rely on to actually clear and hold territory? I mean, they could depend on tribal forces, but this could really get, bloody. We know that, from Iraq that tribal, militias tend to be, very, bloody and ruthless. And I mean, the U.S. I think is starting to get more involved in the target selection because of these collateral damages. My big concern is, what is Yemen going to look like when this is all done? What the Saudis are doing is essentially decimating the the Yemeni military, which is needed for some sort of political transition down the road. So, I mean, I think we're looking at a very long and protracted struggle here.
All right. Well, I think I'll open the floor to questions. I'll take them in batches of 3, and if you could identify yourself and your affiliation and keep them short, please. So, yes, this woman here.
Hi. Stephanie Cook with the Energy Intelligence Group. I wanted to just ask Karim if he could elaborate a little bit more about what you just said about the Revolutionary Guards controlling the military sites, and if you think that's a problem area for once, let's say, an agreement is signed, the IAEA closing the file on PMDs. How difficult is it going to be if the Revolutionary Guards are a factor?
Well, I thought the previous panel covered that issue very well, and Jessica made a very good point, which that the focus of the agreement should be about the future more than the past. But listen, I don't think that's going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. That was, I think, a valid. That for me was one of the most valid things which Kissinger and Schultz articulated in their op-ed about the implementation. And we could hold a one-week conference about the flaws of this framework agreement, and the question would still be, okay, what are the better alternatives? You have a situation in which two countries profoundly mistrust one another, and this is why I think that this is the success of this agreement will be measured over the years, not in the weeks and months ahead. But I think the 2 points are worth noting. One is that if Iran signs this deal and they're caught with hidden facilities, that would be hugely costly for them in a way which it wouldn't be if there was no agreement signed. And then second, you have now a population which overwhelmingly wants to see this deal happen, which overwhelmingly wants to be economically integrated and no longer under sanctions. And I think there would be a very strong economic impetus for the regime to continue to cooperate. So I would never make a prediction about having confidence in the Revolutionary Guards opening up their sites to verification and coming clean on past nuclear activities, because in a way they feel like they'll only incriminate themselves by doing that. So that's going to be something that needs to be worked out. But I agree with the thrust of the first panel, which is that there aren't great alternatives to having to trust and verify. Mistrust and verify, I should say.
All right, Barbara.
Thanks so much. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and I'll monitor. And forgive me, I came in a little bit late, but I wanted to get a better sense from all the panelists of whether there was a possibility for overt hostilities between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I see that the Iranians have canceled the minor pilgrimage now to Saudi. There are big crowds outside the Saudi embassy in Tehran chanting death to Saudi Arabia. Do you think there's a possibility of actual overt hostilities, or will this stay a proxy fight?
Let's grab a couple more questions, maybe. Yeah, in the back, there's a hand there.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, formerly of USDA. I'm just listening to what everybody's saying here, and it sounds to me that no one in Hollywood could write a script to describe what's going on in the Middle East. It's sort of like the inmates in charge of the insane asylum. Having said that, you haven't said anything about the proliferation problem. Russia is going to build a nuclear something in Egypt. Saudi Arabia has talked about it. Where is this going? Thank you.
And this gentleman here.
Were we the inmates in that question? I wasn't sure whether.
Peter Wilson Rand. The question I direct you all is the state that has been mentioned, which is Iraq, and how this affair may affect either U.S.-Iranian cooperation in, quote-unquote, containing and destroying ISIS, and what the implication about the future of Iraq. As they say, how is this going to turn out, and will this be affected by that?
Okay. So just a note on the Saudi protest issue and the canceling of the Umrah. The proximate cause is this case of sexual harassment of two Iranian teenagers accused by Saudi officials at the airport, but certainly underlying that is kind of all the existing tensions. Fred, maybe you want to tackle that one?
I mean, I think a real conventional struggle or conflict is unlikely. I mean, I think Iran would, be foolish to open it or escalate it to that level. I mean, look at the state of the Emirati Air Force vis-a-vis the Iranian Air Force. There's always the potential for miscalculation in the shared, waterway of the Gulf. Some enterprising Iranian commander gets a little too, aggressive. But I think, precedent shows us that this war will be waged in the shadows, proxy war. And I think the Saudis and the Iranians in the past have had the ability to almost compartmentalize their conflict. So in one region of the Middle East, there'll be this shadowware, this hostility, and they'll be talking to each other on another file.
And certainly, it's probably the case in Iraq as well, given some of given the Iranian-backed militias cooperating, or in some sense, with the United States.
Right.
How would you answer the concerns? I don't think this came up in the first panel that Saudi Arabia is simply going to buy a nuclear weapon from Pakistan, or build their own indigenous program. I mean, how do you usually answer that?
Well, there's just tremendous, political disincentives for them to do that vis-a-vis their relations with the United States, breaking the NPT. There's questions about the technical ability. I mean, this is the standard line, but I think that they realize that would be such a break with their security patron, and it would incur a series of follow-on consequences that I think they're going to try to hedge. I mean, they may try to build up a certain capacity, civilian capacity, but their primary response will be a massive conventional buildup.
I wanted to come back to the issue of Iraq, but take a different angle on this, and not just about Iraq. I mean, what's being missed in all this, I think, is that even if there's a high level of cooperation between any of these major players, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in particular, whether on Yemen or on Iraq or anywhere else, we have a reality, which is that Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and potentially one or two others are basically collapsed states. And the political dynamics, the institutional cohesion in most of these countries is worse than it's ever been. And it's not clear how those things are going to be rebuilt. Fred made a very good point, I think, about the Saudis undermining one of the key institutions in Yemen that's going to be needed for reconstruction, rebuilding, peace building, whatever. That same comment can be made of almost every other case. I mean, look at Iraq, where everyone's in such a hurry to push back the Islamic State, which as a strategic goal, of course, is entirely correct. But in terms of how quickly you go into that and how you go about it, all that I can see happening is the rush to put boots on the ground and guns in the hands of new recruits yet again, which is what the U.S. response was back in the mid-2000s when the Iraqi state needed to be built, but instead of which U.S. planning went from a 40,000-man army to 250,000 and still growing. And now yet again we have immediate emergency measures undertaken to confront the Islamic State, creating a Sunni militia, a tribal militia, Shia militias, under different names and with all sorts of caveats about how these are actually meant to be national institutions, none of which actually are central state institutions. And so in a way, victory against the Islamic State might be worse than having a fight with the Islamic State, because victory leaves us with the big question of what is the Iraqi state? Is there an Iraqi state? At least for the Arab portions of Iraq. And so my concern, and this maybe touches on the question from the back about the inmates of the asylum. I mean, we're focusing a lot on the political players, the big names, the headlines. What I see is institutions that are failing and societies that are massively traumatized and dislocated in each of these countries. I don't see what's going to put Libya back together again. And if all we can think of is the Egyptian, Qatari, Emirati, Saudi, Shia, Sunni strife over Libya, we're missing a lot of the point, something that Fred has written about repeatedly, and that is the very local dynamics of the conflict. The same can be said of Iraq for sure, and of Syria for sure, and certainly of Yemen. And I don't see any of these players investing the sort of resources, whether these are political or financial or other, in these countries that can help them get back on the road to recovery. And frankly, even if they tried to put in these resources, you don't build states and countries and national identities easily, even if you're willing to put everything you've got into this. So what I'm suggesting, and this again goes to the question at the back, is that we are, I think, in a sort of a historical phase. It's a longue durée in which we're not talking about a crisis for a year or two. There are massive social transformations in most of these societies that have finally started to produce political, very overt, very violent, in this case, political consequences. So, places like Iraq and Syria, in a way, are being reorganized at some level. I mean, the Sunni armed militias of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq have a very different understanding of what the Sunni political space is. They're not going to end up actually creating a new alternative state, but that is how they organize violence. And the Shia militias that have become increasingly sectarian and Shia themselves from Lebanon all the way through Syria and on to Iraq, in a sense have a counter-imagining of what they see as a common Shia space, which won't result in a single Shia state. But I think we're talking about deconstruction and reconstruction of different kinds of political entities. It probably won't go as far as that finally, and what will stay stuck in is a lot of very local conflict.
Speaking of sort of oversimplifications, Fred, you've written persuasively on the oversimplification specifically in Libya between moderate and Islamists, and that seems to be kind of another dynamic in the region as well.
Well, I think it's a huge. I mean, yeah. In the case of Libya, it's multiple overlapping identities. It's a struggle between the old order, the old officer class, and the younger revolutionary camp. But I mean, we tend to overlay these categorizations, whether it's Islamist, non-Islamist, Sunni versus Shia, because it makes sense. I mean, and it fits into a broader, regional narrative. But as we've heard in the case of Yemen, I mean, this is at its core primarily a center-periphery dispute. It's about governance. The sectarian dimension is just one identity of many different affiliations that's driving the conflict, I think.
Take another round of questions. This gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Farzan Speb. I'm a visiting fellow at Georgetown and editing manager of IranPolitics.com. Thank you all for your presentation. My question goes to Karim. So you very nicely presented both a pessimistic and optimistic perspective on how Iran's policies in the region could change. And the optimistic view was that Iran's regional policy could soon be driven by national interests versus ideology. But it seems that Iran's interventions in places in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen also have may actually be mainly driven by national security interest, and that there's actually a consensus within the regime. So I'm wondering, do you really feel like there's an alternative centrist reformist perspective within the regime, and what factors could help bring such a shift about? Thank you.
It's a very good question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, this lady right here, and then in the back.
Hi, I'm Tova Northern from SICE. I have a question about Israel. Somebody mentioned Israel just in passing. I'm just curious to know, how influential do you think that Israel has been in terms of its actions and in particular Netanyahu's behavior in pushing Iran into cooperation with the U.S. To close this first deal? And how do you think that it's going to influence the rest of the next few months? Thank you.
The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Lauren Hershey, a semi-retired attorney. I've been following affairs with a big picture view, and I think you've generated a question which I'd like to make very simple. When will there be let's call it a Congress of Vienna, that will reset boundaries?
All right. You want to start?
Sure. So, the first question about, are there those in Iran who are arguing for a different approach towards the region? What would that look like? Certainly not openly. People like Zarif and others are not openly arguing for different Iranian policies in the region. But let me make a broader point, which is that I see distinctions between the ideological interests of the Islamic Republic and the national interests of Iran. A lot of people would disagree with me and say that the Islamic Republic is simply pursuing Iran's national interests. I'll tell you why I disagree with that. And now we can open up another debate about what are national interests, right? Yazid is the academic on the panel, can speak to this more than I can. But for me, it's fairly simple. A simple definition is that national interests are furthering the economic prosperity and security of your population, right? And so how does it further the economic prosperity and the security of the Iranian people to chant death to America and death to Israel? The urgent national security concerns of Iran, as you outlined, are these these kind of radical Sunni militant groups who are now tens of miles from Iran's borders, and if given the opportunity, they would behead any Iranian they could find. The urgent national security concerns of Iran is not Israel, which is thousands of miles away. And quite frankly, if you talk to senior Israeli generals, they would like to have a cooperative relationship with Iran. I think if John Kerry and President Obama could push a button and normalize relations with Iran and improve the relationship with Iran, they would do so. But I think I think frankly a normal relationship between the U.S. and Iran would further the economic prosperity of the Iranian people, and it would further the security of the Iranian people. But that's inimical to the ideological interests of the regime. And when I say ideological interests of the regime, I mean that I think the people who control power are shrewd enough to appreciate the fact that they do so. They can much more easily do so in a closed environment rather than an open environment. So just to go to the point, and again, I don't think this is being articulated by anyone in the Iranian system, but I think at a popular level, it's certainly articulated that our current regional policies don't reflect national interests. And the last thing I'd say is, when I look at the difference between Turkey and Iran in the Middle East, in the year 2000, I believe Arab foreign investment in Turkey was less than $1 billion. In about a decade, that number went up 10x. It went up, I think, 10 times that. So a lot of folks in the Arab world, whether the Gulf or elsewhere, were looking to Turkey as an economic example, and they were investing in Turkey. Now, look at Iran's interventions in the Middle East. It's hemorrhaging tens of billions of dollars on the Assad regime, on Hezbollah, on Islamic Jihad in Palestine, on Houthis in Yemen, although that I think is probably exaggerated. But is this creating jobs for Iranian people? It's creating jobs for Arab militants. Is it creating jobs for the Iranian people? Is it this furthering the prosperity of Iran? Is it furthering the security of Iran? I would answer no to all those questions. So I'm one who believes that there is a real contradiction between the ideological interests of the regime and the national interests of Iran. But many would disagree with me on that.
Do you want to address the Israel question?
I think, Yazid, do you want to take that?
No, I
can't. You live closest to...
All I would suggest, I can't answer on the here and now, and I think you've been following the nuclear issue, maybe Fred, but I would point out that two things actually. One is there's a very interesting recent article by Shai Feldman, who was one of the very first people to analyze Israel's nuclear capability, put this on public discussion back in 1981, and he's arguing that if you actually read Netanyahu's speeches, and I think the one to Congress more carefully, then you see a lot of things which he's criticized but not closed the door on. Now, that might be an optimistic view, but it might relate to something else I was going to say, which is that over the past few years, whenever I've met Israelis who are very well connected and plugged into specifically the nuclear issue, it's been very clear, and sometimes in public, that there's a large part of the Israeli security establishment, the senior levels, which actually has a rather different view of the Iranian nuclear capability and the program, and has never been as hawkish. Not that they're dovish, but just sort of saying that there are some things we can actually live with. And my question would be, and I'd maybe add to what either of you might, the questions you're going to answer on this. In the coming period, will we see a revival of that debate within Israel, behind the scenes? Are there, in fact, going to be people inside the Israeli security establishment who will have a more accepting view of the whole thing, sort of saying, well, actually, we should keep hammering home our criticism. However, criticism opening up specific doorways to getting, practical alternatives, as we heard in the first panel. It's not just criticizing, it's what you say we should be doing better. And I think there are probably going to be people inside Israel who do take that approach. So it'll be interesting to see if that sort of debate does develop there.
Just the one sentence I'd say on Israel is that in the zero-sum worldview of the hardliners in Tehran, that which is bad for Israel is good for Iran, and this has been a way they've tried to sell this to their own constituency. If Netanyahu hates this, it must be good for us.
There have been some interesting cartoons with referencing Kayhan, the very hardline newspaper taking the same view on the deal as
Netanyahu.
Fred, do you want to address this issue of maybe not a Congress of Vienna, but some sort of reorganization fundamentally?
Well, the reorganization is happening. I mean, the question really is, does that lead to a formal, redrawing of boundaries? And I mean, this idea has been floated throughout the 2000s. And again, like the Shia-Sunni divide, I think it's very seductive to sort of trace these problems back to the colonial, era. I think there's a number of problems with it. I mean, first of all, the new, zones of governance. I mean, establishing these new boundaries, I think it would be accompanied by tremendous violence, tremendous population transfers. If you look at sort of the local micro level, these so-called blocks of communities that we would build these new states around are often very divided amongst themselves. A Shia living in eastern Saudi Arabia does not necessarily want to be part of a Shia state living, with the Iraqi Shia. I mean, there's tremendous familial, ethnic dimensions there. Same thing with even the Kurds. I think what we are living in is a return or a reaction to the hyper-centralization that defined much of the Arab political sphere under these Republican regimes that are collapsing. Certainly, that's the case when I go to Libya, and so I think what we're seeing is the emergence of de facto zones of autonomy marked by what I call hybrid governance, where you've got quote official forces that are working with tribal and societal forces, and so it's sort of de facto separatism or de facto autonomy, federalism. That's the reality we're living in, and to be honest, that's the way much of the Arab world has been. I think even under the Ottomans, under the British and the French, there were always these zones where the authorities had a very loose and tenuous relationship with local actors. So.
Right, we have time maybe for like one or two more questions. This woman in the front here.
I'm Veronica Cartier, researcher for international conflict management. You have brought up, or considering regional policy, the challenge in greater transparency and future conflicts. So will it be possible, or is it ideal, to think about possibility of U.S.-Iran deal into two sets of agreement? Say that technical agreement, which is we are dealing with now, also with bilateral cooperation between U.S.-Iran, which is guaranteed that Iran supports for U.S. foreign policy in Middle East, whatever future conflict would be, or and I think is maybe that agreement of bilateral cooperation between U.S. and Iran, especially in the security sector, considering that China expansion to the Middle East and maybe other element of security conflicts in the future. So that's my question: is it possible that we could draft it that U.S. Iran cooperation in security sector, that Iran would be in support of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East? Okay. Thank you.
One more question. Yes, this gentleman here.
Edward Levine, formerly with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I wonder if we could bring the discussion back to the Iran nuclear framework and ask if you are, let us posit, a concerned Republican who is trying to do the right thing, and you have many experts saying this deal, for better or for worse, is about the best you're going to get. But at the same time, you have Israelis, Saudis, and all of our other friends saying this is awful. What should Congress do?
That's a great question.
You want to start, Fred?
Yeah.
Well, listen, I'd say could there be a security arrangement in which Iran supports U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East? No. Short answer to that. It's not going to happen anytime soon. We'll never go back to a situation which we were during the time of the Shah, when, I shouldn't say never, but at least in the next decade and a half, where Iran and the U.S. are basically acting in unison in the region. I think there are tremendous overlapping interests between the two sides, but as long as you have a supreme leader in Iran who gives speeches when crowds are chanting death to America, there's going to continue to be a tenuous regional relationship. On the role of Congress, I thought that the previous panel, I don't know if you attended that. I thought they put that well. I would just add that there's 2 points about Congress. One is that in all my experience interacting with members of Congress, what animates them most about Iran is less centrifuges and enriched uranium, but more Holocaust denial and rejection of Israel's existence and Hezbollah and these groups. And the concern they have at the moment is that if this nuclear deal is merely tactical, it's just nuclear compromise in exchange for financial relief, and Iran is going to pursue its same regional policies, that's a concern for them. So I think it's understandable if that's the context, if they view things primarily in the regional context, in the context of Israel's national security, it's going to continue to be a concern for them. But I think the dissonance amongst members of Congress is the fact that on one hand they have that valid concern and cynicism about Iran's regional policies. At the same time, they represent a country, a population, which doesn't want another war in the Middle East. And so if they somehow scuttle this deal, it will make conflict with Iran that much more likely, something which I think vast majority of Americans want to avoid. So, I'm personally not opposed to some type of a process of congressional oversight if I thought that would be a responsible congressional oversight, but that's a huge caveat.
Why don't I step in immediately on the way to Fred on that issue? As someone who lives in the region and sort of is trying to reflect the viewpoint of ordinary local people who may be very polarized when if they're pro-Iranian or pro-Hezbollah or pro-whatever, very anti-Hezbollah, they're going to support or oppose the deal pretty much along the same lines as you see here. What I want to get across, I think, is that getting some sort of agreement on the Iranian nuclear program is extremely important. Let's keep that in sight. It is an important thing to do. What drives Saudi hostility or Israeli hostility, etc., they're not all one and the same thing. Saudi hostility, for instance, goes way back. I mean, the Saudis were nervous about Iran's military expansion under the Shah. Their bad relations with the Islamic Republic go back to the beginning, way before it was about the nuclear issue. So the fact that the Saudis are at war, almost literally now, with Iran, is not specifically because of the nuclear issue. And resolving the nuclear issue, even to Israeli satisfaction and Saudi satisfaction, let's say the Iranians totally disarmed their nuclear capability or whatever, undertook to dismantle the entire program, would that necessarily end the competition and the distrust and the enmity? No. So I think from the Congress's point of view of people in the West generally, is to try you can't compartmentalize entirely, but you want to be able to say what constitutes a secure deal, a good deal, a deal that does really do what the earlier panel said it could do in terms of heading off nuclear weapons capability, versus continuing to confront and challenge on other issues. And frankly, if those challengers, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's the US and others, can't come up with better policy responses on all the other ills that face people in the region, except more weapons. I mean, that's usually what the answer is. Here are some more precision-guided weapons to Saudi Arabia, which hardly needs them, to bomb one of the poorest nations on earth and destroy more of the infrastructure. That may be a necessary thing to do in the immediate situation, maybe. But I want to see more investment on all the other policy responses. That's something that the US has always tried to do, the soft power aspect, economic assistance, institutional training, capacity building, etc. Let's see a bit more of that, rather than curtailing some of those programs, which is also happening. So I think for Congress, the answer should be, let's identify what is a deal that is workable and continue to monitor it and push it forward. And that is something separate from continuing to work with allies and friends in the region about what makes them unhappy, because they're not always right. And, when it comes to Israeli expansion of settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that is a case in point of where the U.S. has publicly at times, and sometimes not sufficiently publicly, distinguished its position or, separated its position from that of Israel, just as it can do with Saudi Arabia on some issues or with Egypt on other issues, such as human rights and democracy. And the idea that it can't distinguish itself from these countries and continue to have a dialogue with them and cooperation with them on strategic issues is wrong, of course. And Congress should be able to see its way through that.
On this notion of Iran becoming part of a regional security, framework. Again, Kareem and I have written that. The real elephant in the room of the regional order, the thing that transcends whatever kind of regime is present in Tehran, is the security of the Gulf. The Gulf states have always felt like the junior partner vis-a-vis Iran. Iran wants to regionalize Gulf security. The Gulf Arab states want to internationalize it. They want an external balancer, and that goes back to the time of the Shah. So again, how can Iran be brought into a constructive regional framework that allows the U.S. to extricate itself? I think that's going to be a long way off. Perhaps you could see some incremental confidence-building measures on maritime security, counter-piracy. I think some of this is already going on with the Omanis, but we're a long way off from the Iranians being totally brought in, I think. So.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists and thank you all for coming and for your questions.